It was a night like any other in Silver Creek. The sky burned orange with the last breath of daylight. Children pedaled home from the park, and the town settled into the rhythm of another peaceful evening. But peace was an illusion. Beneath the grandeur of the Hale estate, behind heavy curtains and locked doors, a child's voice broke into the dark, a cry so faint it dissolved into silence before it ever reached the street. No human heard it, but Orion did. The German shepherd stopped dead in his tracks, ears pricked, body rigid. His handler, Detective Ethan Cole, tried to coax him forward, but the old canine wouldn't move. Instead, his nose lifted, his body vibrated with tension, and a growl rumbled deep in his throat. That's when Ethan noticed the ribbon at the base of the gate. Pink, torn, with a single strand of blonde hair clinging stubbornly to its knot. For Ethan, it was déjà vu, the stirring of instincts he'd buried after his wife's death. For Orion, it was simple truth. There was fear inside that house, and fear never lies. The evening light settled over Silver Creek like a quiet prayer. Autumn had always been kind to this small Montana town. The maples lining Main Street glowed with copper leaves, and the fading sunlight set them aflame as if the whole town were caught inside a lantern. Porch swings creaked gently. A screen door banged shut somewhere, followed by the faint laughter of children pedaling their bicycles home before the darkness deepened. From a distance, Silver Creek looked like a painting, all symmetry and calm, every lawn trimmed, every house framed by shutters painted in earth tones. To most, it was the kind of place where nothing truly bad could happen. To Ethan Cole, it was both sanctuary and cage. He walked slowly along Fairview Lane, his boots scuffing the gravel at the edge of the pavement. Beside him, Orion, his German shepherd, matched his pace with the unhurried grace of a soldier, long retired, but never off duty. Orion's muzzle had begun to gray, though the sharpness in his amber eyes had not dimmed. His ears flicked at every shift in the air, at every rustle from the hedges. The leash between them was loose, more a symbol than a restraint. Orion didn't need it. He had once been trained to follow commands in war zones where hesitation meant death. Now, in the calm of Silver Creek, his instincts carried a different weight. To protect, to watch, to be present. Ethan glanced at him with something close to gratitude. Orion was steady, where he himself was not. The detective's own reflection in the windows they passed was harder to look at. He was still young enough, early 40s, but his face carried the creases of someone older. War had left its marks, and so had grief. His wife, Anna, gone 3 years now, had left behind an empty side of the bed that no amount of sleepless nights could fill. Ethan's eyes were often described as cold, but the truth was simpler. They were tired. Tonight, like every night, the walk was a ritual. Dinner had been a plate of reheated leftovers, eaten in silence. Afterward, he clipped the leash to Orion's harness, and together they circled the town. For Ethan, it was a way to keep moving. For Orion, it was a way to keep listening. As they walked, Ethan's thoughts drifted back, uninvited, to the desert. The memory of burning sand and concussive blasts still clung to him. He remembered the sound of Orion barking over the chaos, that one sharp signal that had once pulled him away from a roadside bomb in Afghanistan. Men had died that day. He hadn't. Not because of his training, not because of luck, but because of this dog at his side. A sigh escaped him, turning to vapor in the cooling air. The rhythm of their walk was steady, until Orion's head suddenly lifted, his ears pricked, body tensing. Ethan noticed the shift instantly, the change from casual pacing to alertness. Orion's nose tested the breeze, nostrils twitching. Ethan slowed, scanning the row of houses ahead. The street was empty, quiet, just the hum of streetlights flickering to life. "Easy," Ethan murmured, giving the leash a light tug. Orion's steps grew measured, almost stalking, his eyes fixed ahead, unblinking. It was in moments like this that Ethan felt the sharp divide between himself and the rest of Silver Creek. Neighbors waved at him, said hello at the post office, admired Orion's stature when he accompanied Ethan to town events. But none of them truly understood the quiet vigilance that never left his bones, or his dogs. The town believed in appearances. Ethan and Orion believed in instincts. They passed a row of hedges where the air smelled faintly of wood smoke and fallen leaves. Ethan's gaze lifted to the Hale mansion at the end of the street, a massive colonial-style house with white columns that loomed like a sentinel over Fairview Lane. For a second, his thoughts drifted to its owner, Victor Hale, the reclusive entrepreneur whose life had turned tragic after his wife's death. Ethan had never been close to him, but grief recognized grief. Orion gave a soft whine, pulling Ethan back to the present. The dog's tail was stiff, body angled toward the mansion. Ethan frowned. "What is it, boy?" he asked softly. The German shepherd didn't respond with sound, just stood rooted, every muscle taut, as though waiting for something hidden to move. Ethan rested a hand on his shoulder, feeling the faint tremor of tension beneath fur. He knew that posture. He had seen it in deserts and alleys, moments before Orion indicated a hidden trap. But this was Silver Creek, a town of clean lawns and polite hellos, a town where people didn't lock their doors until bedtime. "Come on," Ethan said, though his own voice lacked conviction. He tugged the leash gently. Orion moved, but reluctantly, casting one last long stare at the Hale place. As they continued their walk, Ethan's mind wouldn't quiet. He glanced back once, watching as the mansion's windows glowed in the twilight. They reflected nothing of the inside, just the fading orange of the sky. But Ethan felt, with an old detective's unease, that the beauty of Silver Creek was only skin deep. Somewhere in the hush of dusk, beneath the creak of porch swings and the laughter of children heading inside, there was something else. Something Orion sensed, and Ethan couldn't yet name. The walk ended back at his modest home on the edge of town, where the porch light buzzed faintly, and the air smelled of pine from the surrounding woods. Ethan unclipped the leash, letting Orion wander the yard. The dog sniffed the wind again, ears tilting back toward Fairview Lane, as if his mind was still there. Ethan watched him, then turned his gaze to the darkening horizon. He had come to Silver Creek for quiet, for the illusion that life could be simple again. But tonight, for the first time, he felt that illusion tremble. In the silence, Orion padded back to his side and sat. His eyes were steady, watchful, carrying a warning Ethan had not yet learned how to hear. And so, the town of Silver Creek, painted golden by dusk, carried on in its calm. But Ethan Cole and his dog knew, deep down, that the night was holding something back. Something was waiting. They reached the bend where Fairview Lane rose like a careful breath and leveled in front of the Hale place. The light had thinned to the color of old copper. Porch bulbs blinked on up and down the street, one by one, like a line of small stars deciding whether night could be trusted. Orion was a shadow against that light, muscle and silence, padding a step ahead, then two, then stopping so suddenly the leash drew tight in Ethan's hand. The German shepherd's weight set, shoulders squared. A soft sound, not quite a growl, tremored in his throat and vibrated along the leash into Ethan's palm. It wasn't the harsh warning Ethan had heard in deserts and alleys. It was lower, older, an animal saying, "I know this smell, and it is not right." "Easy," Ethan murmured, easing forward until he stood beside him. The mansion climbed the night with its white pillars and immaculate hedge line, a geometry of money and polish. Curtains glowed a neutral gold behind the panes. No movement, no sound. If a house could wear a mask, this one did, perfectly. Orion's nose sampled the air. One breath, then a second, deeper, the way he used to read the wind before a patrol. His ears, those perfect radar dishes, tilted hard left. The dog's tail lowered, not tucked, just heavy, like a pendulum filled with thought. He took a step toward the black iron gate and touched it with one paw, then the other, posture tall, a sentinel requesting entry. "Come on," Ethan said, though the words were for himself. The street held the cool of the creek that gave the town its name. Somewhere, a sprinkler coughed to life and rained its tinny chorus over a perfect lawn. Ordinary sounds, ordinary evening. Still, that thread of tension tugged. Orion's body stiffened. The growl deepened, barely there. Ethan glanced up at the second-floor windows. Nothing. He'd walked this way 100 times, nodding to the same drifts of roses, passing the same flag that hung without a crease. He knew the story they told. Victor Hale, brilliant and broken, hiding himself away after his wife's death. A daughter, 8, kept close. A partner, people said, in the careful voice used for gossip that might draw blood. Ethan knelt, palm on Orion's chest. The dog's heart was steady but strong, a drum played by a careful hand. "What are you telling me, buddy?" That's when it came. A sound so faint Ethan thought at first it belonged to his memory. A small, smothered cry, as if something fragile had folded in on itself and tried to be air. It lasted the length of a single heartbeat, and then was gone, swallowed by the big house and all its empty manners. Ethan rose, a slow uncoiling. The knuckles of his right hand pressed white against the leash. He listened into the quiet, the way you listen for your name in a crowd. Wind slid through the maple crowns. A porch swing somewhere counted the seconds. He held his breath. Nothing. Orion didn't need the echo. He stepped to the gate again and laid his paw upon it, claws clicking soft against iron, not scratching, announcing. He looked up at Ethan with those amber eyes that always seemed to hold two truths: the world as it wanted to be, and the world as it was. Ethan's throat worked. Training tugged one way. Without cause, you don't knock. Not here, not now, not based on a dog's worry and a man's ghosts. The other tug came from the place in him that had not healed since the last time he didn't listen soon enough. He took a step to the hedge line instead, not toward the door, but along the property's edge, where the iron fence met a collar of low-cut boxwood. Orion tracked beside him, head low, scenting. The hedge smelled of clipped green and damp earth, and beneath that, faintly metallic, like a coin held too long in the mouth. The dog halted again, angled his muzzle to a seam in the bushes. Ethan parted the leaves. There, in the dark nest where the hedge's branches braided, lay a small thing that did not belong to shrubs or soil. A ribbon, pink, cheap satin, gone dulled by the dust, and the knot in its middle was wrong. Not a bow's cheerful double loop, but a hard, angry thing twisted tight, as if hands had yanked until the fabric surrendered. A few strands clung to that knot, catching the last of the light. Fine and pale, the color of wheat before harvest. Ethan didn't breathe for a second. Memory can be cruel in its generosity. He saw a hospital room years ago, the way Anna's hair had come free from its band and spilled over a pillow, and how he had gathered it in his fingers like a man trying to cup a river. The present took him back by the jaw. He slid the ribbon into his palm. The satin was cold, gritty with dirt. He rolled it gently, not to hide it, but to keep the knot visible, the way evidence men do. Orion leaned in, breathed it once, twice, then sat, a deliberate choice. The posture he took when he had found the thing he'd been asked, or in this case, the thing he could not ignore. "Okay," Ethan said, voice quiet enough that only the dog and the hedge might hear. "Okay." He looked up at the house. The windows had gone a shade dimmer, as if someone had walked down the hall, and the light traveled with her. No figure crossed any frame. It could have been nothing. It could have been a television, an automatic dimmer, the way evening rearranges itself without permission. He felt the old detective in him take a step forward and the careful citizen take one back. He folded the ribbon into his jacket pocket, keeping the knot turned outward. The edges rasped his finger. Orion's gaze didn't leave the house. The dog wasn't a creature of maybe. He knew what he knew. "Let's move," Ethan said. And they did, but not far. He walked the perimeter once, slow, the way a man might walk a memory he's afraid to wake. The flag at the corner of the porch hardly stirred. The roses held their neat dead heads, like tiny prayers, not yet answered. A brass kickplate shone on the front door without a single scuff to give it character. The world here had been arranged to project the kind of peace that doesn't make room for questions. At the driveway apron, the gate's hinge creaked, just once, a private sound. Orion's ear flicked. Ethan felt the weight of the ribbon in his pocket like a stone someone had placed there without his consent. He imagined the small hand that had worn it, imagined the way an 8-year-old's hair fights a comb in the morning, the way a father bends to fix what the world tangles. He imagined a second hand, older, colder, tightening the knot into a command. They stood for a long half-minute at the corner. A car turned onto Fairview, slowed. Neighbors on their way to somewhere ordinary. The driver lifted 2 fingers from the wheel at Ethan in that small-town salute that means, "I see you, and we are fine." Ethan lifted his chin in return. It felt like a lie he had been asked to agree to. When they were finally moving again, Orion kept glancing back over his shoulder, like a sentry forced to walk away from the only piece of ground that mattered. The growl was gone, but the stiffness stayed along his spine. Ethan matched his pace to the dog's unease, not rushing him into calm he hadn't earned. Past the Hale property, the street seemed different, though nothing had changed but the knowledge inside Ethan's pocket. He felt that fine hair catch against his skin when he moved. He told himself he'd bring it home, bag it like any careful cop would, scribble the time and place, tuck it where it would not be lost. He told himself he'd sleep on it. He had learned to mistrust what rises hot at dusk and cools by morning. They reached the spot where the maples opened, and the sky gave a last tired blaze. Orion slowed. Ethan did too. He listened again, as if sound could repeat on request. The town answered with the things a town always says. A screen door tapping shut, the hush of a television through a wall, someone laughing at something that did not matter. No cry. The absence made the earlier sound more true, not less. At his own gate, Ethan paused. He knelt and put his forehead to Orion's, that old wordless prayer. The dog exhaled through his nose, soft, patient, and lifted one paw to rest it against Ethan's thigh. A gesture so practiced, it felt like memory wearing a new day's clothes. "We heard it," Ethan said, as if the night might argue. "We heard it." Orion's tail tapped once against the packed earth. Inside, Ethan laid the ribbon on his kitchen table, beside the small dish where he kept his keys and a ring he no longer wore. He stared at the knot, at the grit seated into the satin like the past in a scar. He slid open the drawer where his notebook slept and tore a page free. Fairview Lane, Hale property, pink ribbon, fine blonde hair. 1942. Orion alert. Possible. He stopped before the word cry, as if writing it would grant the house a power he wasn't ready to name. In the next room, Orion settled on the rug, not curled but sphinx still, facing the direction of the Hale mansion, as if walls meant nothing to him. His ears were up, waiting. Ethan stood at the sink, the ribbon between two fingers, feeling its small weight pull at him. He had learned to live with ghosts, the old ones wearing his wife's smile, the newer ones wearing sand and noise. But this was not a ghost. This was a thread. Outside, the town closed its eyes and pretended to sleep. Ethan reached for a plastic bag, slid the ribbon inside, sealed the mouth with a careful press. He wrote the time again on masking tape and stuck it to the top. Then he set the little evidence of a little life atop his refrigerator, high and plain, where he keeps what he cannot afford to forget. When he turned off the kitchen light, the house fell into that good, honest dark. Orion didn't move. He kept watching the night like a man keeps a promise. Somewhere, not far, a child learned again how to make her sobs small. And in a quiet house with a tired man, a dog knew the truth and would wait until the man was ready to hear it. In the morning, Silver Creek wore its good manners. Sunlight combed the maples into neat rows of burnished coins. The baker on Main pushed open his door and let the smell of cinnamon rolls slip out to work the street. A mail truck hummed past schoolchildren with backpacks bigger than their shoulders. The town liked to start its day with small, decent noises, proof, perhaps, that goodness could be scheduled. Ethan Cole's house sat 2 blocks off the river bend, half hidden by a pair of blue spruces that had outgrown the promise the realtor made the day he and Anna signed papers. Orion watched the street from the porch as if it were a slow, important movie. He had slept the way trained dogs sleep, still as a stone, awake at the edges. When Ethan stepped out with his coffee, Orion lifted his head but didn't move. His ears were already tuned to a station Ethan couldn't hear. The pink ribbon lay on the kitchen table behind the door, sealed in a clear bag, quiet as a breath held too long. Ethan had written the time twice on the masking tape, as if repetition could hold back doubt. He carried the coffee like a man carrying an answer he didn't want to drink. "Okay," he said, to no one and to the dog both. "Let's walk." They didn't make for the Hale place right away. They took the long loop past the high school ball field and down the street with the antique store that never seemed to sell anything anyone needed. Orion's gate had its usual music to it, 4 beats even, patient. But he stopped more often than usual to test the air. to read the town's pulse the way a medic takes vitals, lightly and without fuss. People waved. Mrs. Halverson, the widow who gardened with a straw hat big enough to cover her shoulders, offered her customary, "Morning, detective," and placed a hand over her heart when Orion, in his quiet dignity, glanced her way and let his tail say hello. Ethan nodded, answering to a name he hadn't felt like for a long time. Titles have a way of outliving the reasons we earn them. By the time they turned onto Fairview, the sun had cleared the courthouse roof and thrown a clean light against the Hale Mansion's white columns. The house looked like money set to music. Someone had repainted the shutters a patient black. The hedges were squared as if a ruler lived in the gardener's pocket. You could search a long time for a flaw and wind up believing there wasn't one. Rumor rarely cared for appearances. It drifted in Silver Creek like seeds on thistledown, catching on fences, clinging to stoops. Victor Hale had built a software company in the kind of garage that exists in origin stories. He sold it before 40 and bought this house with the proceeds, and a promise to his wife that they'd fill it with noise, the good kind. Then the mountain took her. A fall on shale during a sunny hike. A bad step that folded luck into a shape no one recognized. Since then, he had kept his promises to the house, but not to life. The yard stayed perfect. The windows stayed polished. The man disappeared inside the gleam. The town spoke his sorrow in careful phrases. He's grieving. He needs time. At least the little girl has him. And then, whispered softer, "Has anyone seen Clara lately?" Ethan slowed in front of the iron gate without meaning to. Orion did not need the leash to pause. He had already set his weight, eyes fixed on the second-floor panes, where yesterday evening the light had gone dim and a sound had tried to be air. The dog's silence pressed against Ethan's ribs. Beyond the gate, the long front walk lay straight as intention. On the porch, a package sat neat against the door, the kind with a smile printed on the tape. The flag on the white column stood without stirring. No one came or went. "You and your curiosity," Ethan murmured, though the line had no heat. He took a sip of coffee he didn't want and tasted nothing. He could have kept walking. He had learned that sometimes the kindest thing a man can do in a small town is to let a door stay a door. But Orion pivoted, not toward the hedges this time, not to the place where the ribbon had waited like a small confession, but toward the side of the property, where the service drive curled behind the garage and a row of boxwood split to reveal a narrow slot of view. He stepped there and stood tall, head level with the lowest window panes, as if he were trying to read what the glass remembered. Ethan followed the line of the dog's focus. The lower windows reflected the street in a clean, bright lie. The upper windows, bedrooms most likely, had the deeper shine of a mirror that had seen too much. Sometimes glass gathers shadows even at noon. He thought he saw movement, a flick of curtain, a hesitation more than a gesture. He was not sure. Doubt is a polite houseguest when the mind wants to be certain. A door opened, not the front. A side door near the garage, painted the same white as the trim, opened a hand's width and then wider. A woman stepped out into that clipped square of sunlight carrying a small bag of trash and the kind of smile that fits anywhere. She had the cool, spare look of someone who thought a room's quiet belonged to her. Dark hair pulled back, cream blouse, black slacks cut with the geometry of money, pearls at the throat, a single strand, luminous even in ordinary light. The details arranged themselves the way Ethan had been trained to let them, calmly, without comment. And then, quietly, a chill moved his fingers. He had seen a photo, a fundraiser program years ago, the late Mrs. Hale with a similar strand. It could be a coincidence. Pearls visit many necks. But coincidence wears a different perfume than familiarity, and this felt like the latter. She didn't see them first. Orion made sure she did. He didn't bark. He simply existed with a focus that is louder than sound. Her head turned. Her smile reached them the way some mail does, addressed incorrectly but delivered anyway. "Beautiful dog," she called, voice bright enough to belong to morning. "Thanks," Ethan said. The word came sanded, even. He did not introduce himself. "There is a small grace in not giving a stranger the name she can write on your door." "You're out early," she said, as if the town were a parlor and he had arrived before the music started. "Habit. Good habit." She tied the bag with a practiced snap and set it gently into the bin, the way one might set down something breakable. Her eyes touched the leash, the harness, the calm that lived in Orion's posture. People who dislike dogs often pretend they don't notice them. She noticed. Nothing in her face moved to show it. "Do you live here?" Ethan asked, as if he didn't know the answer the rumor mill had already tried to sell him. "I help Mr. Hale keep things running," she said. "I'm Selina Ward." The name sat flat in the air, like a coin on a counter. He could have laid his own name beside it. He did not. "Victor around?" "He's resting," she said, with a smile that tucked the word resting into a soft blanket and slid it out of sight. "It's better if he isn't disturbed in the mornings." "I won't disturb him." Ethan held the sentence the way you hold a door ajar. Selina's gaze flicked to the upper windows. The flick was small, practiced, the kind that plants a flower and pretends someone else watered it. "Can I help you with something?" Orion shifted his weight, the way a tide shifts, silent, inevitable. His nose traveled to the light wind that ran its hands over the eaves. His eyes never left Selina's. "No," Ethan said. "Just walking." "Lovely," she replied, and the way she said it made the word sound like a verdict. She turned her shoulder, opening her body toward the door, even as her face kept the porch. It was a subtle thing, the kind of move a person makes when she wants to end a conversation without letting the other person notice they've been dismissed. Ethan had been dismissed in better rooms than this, and by people with sharper knives. He let it pass. "Tell Mr. Hale the town is thinking of him," he said. "I will," she answered, and for the first time her smile didn't hold. "We appreciate good thoughts." The door closed. Not a slam. A careful, gentle shut that ended the morning's performance and left the stage empty. The house looked no different. The windows held to their gleam. The flag didn't stir. Somewhere, a light went on 2 rooms back. The kind of light that lives on a timer and doesn't care who's in the house to see it. Ethan stood at the edge of the drive long enough to feel foolish for standing there. He exhaled through his nose. The coffee had cooled to the taste of pennies. "Let's go, partner," he said. The word partner still found its way to Orion, without scraping any grief. The dog fell into step, but he checked his pace twice to glance back over his shoulder, like someone leaving a bedside before the patient wakes. They took the narrow sidewalk along the side fence, where the boxwood made a green wall, and a cluster of pale petals had dropped and stuck to the damp earth. Ethan noticed footprints in the soft dirt, not large, not small enough to be a child, a woman's, a man wearing light shoes. Silver Creek's ground offered up its clues the way polite people offer second helpings, if asked. By the time they reached the corner, the town had resumed its story. A delivery van hissed to a stop 2 doors down. A teenager jogged past with earbuds, his breath fogging in faint puffs. Orion's ears flicked at everything and settled on nothing. Ethan felt the helplessness slide under his ribs, the way cold finds a seam in a coat. The law in him knew the rules, the warrant you needed, the cause you had to show. The man in him knew the rule. Grief can't teach you until it has taken what it came for. You don't always get another chance to listen. He had a ribbon in a bag and a rumor with a name. He had a dog who believed the world and a house that wanted him not to. He had no proof. Proof is a door with a lock you must open in the right way, or it will never be a door for you again. Orion nudged his knee once, a reminder or a comfort, or both. "All right," Ethan said softly. "We'll do it right." He didn't believe the words as much as he needed to. He walked them out of Fairview, past the maples that flamed without heat, past the baker putting the second tray in the window, past the place where small talk blooms. Behind him, the Hale mansion folded its quiet back over itself like a careful bedspread. In an upper window, the curtain moved, or maybe it didn't. A child's hand may have found the edge of fabric and kept still. A shadow may have learned to breathe like a thing alive. Ethan did not look back again, not with his head, but his thoughts turned and turned, the way a man turns a key he hasn't yet earned the right to use. Orion carried the morning in his nose and the night in his eyes. The leash between them hung loose, a length of simple trust stretched taut by what neither could name. In Silver Creek the day brightened. In Ethan Cole the light did not. He walked on, the ribbon riding above his heart in a clear bag, and the name Selina Ward settling into his memory like a shadow behind glass, seen, not touched, present, not proven. Ethan Cole had learned to live with silence, though he never quite trusted it. The silence of Silver Creek was different from the silence he had known before, different from the tense hush in interrogation rooms where the air itself seemed to wait for a confession, different from the heavy pause of a battlefield right before the mortars began to fall. Here, silence came with the ticking of porch clocks, the rustle of leaves swept down neat sidewalks, the occasional bark of a neighbor's dog. It was the kind of quiet most men prayed for. But Ethan had learned the hard way that quiet was where ghosts preferred to live. He sat at the edge of his bed in the dim light of dawn, elbows braced on his knees, watching Orion stretch near the window. The dog rose slow, deliberate, like a soldier who understood there was no point in rushing into a day that would unfold whether he welcomed it or not. Orion padded over and pressed his head into Ethan's hand, that same unspoken question he had offered every morning since the desert. Are we moving forward today, or are we staying with the ghosts? Ethan stroked the silver-flecked fur along Orion's neck. "We're moving," he muttered. His voice sounded foreign in the empty room. 3 years earlier, he would have woken to another sound, the muffled laughter of Anna in the kitchen, the smell of coffee brewing because she knew he hated mornings, but loved the ritual of pretending. She had been his anchor, his reprieve from homicide cases that stripped away the last illusions about what people could do to one another. In those years, he had carried the weight of every victim whose eyes he had closed, every family he had broken with a truth they didn't want but needed. And yet, coming home to her had been the one thing that reminded him he was more than his job. Then came the accident. One moment of bad timing on an icy road, a drunk driver who never saw the stop sign, and Ethan's world had cracked open. There were no witnesses, no culprits to interrogate, just wreckage on a black stretch of highway, and a hospital room where he sat with her hand in his until it grew cold. The silence that followed wasn't peace. It was punishment. He had left homicide soon after. The department didn't push. Everyone could see he was carrying too many shadows. They shifted him into a quieter role. Community patrols. Cold cases that no one expected him to solve. It was work that kept his badge warm and his pension safe. It didn't demand the sharpness he no longer trusted in himself. But Orion never dulled. The German Shepherd had once been trained for something more precise than bombs or bullets. In Afghanistan, handlers had whispered that Orion had a nose for fear itself. He had saved lives not just by sniffing out explosives, but by sensing the tremor in the air when something was wrong before men could even name it. Ethan had seen him stop a patrol cold on a dirt road minutes before an ambush broke. He had seen him turn toward a prisoner whose face wore innocence, but whose heartbeat betrayed a lie. And now, here in Silver Creek, the dog's instincts had shifted again. He wasn't chasing sand-born ghosts anymore. He was restless with a new kind of tension. Last night's walk had confirmed it. Orion's body had locked in front of the Hale mansion. His growl so low it had rattled through the leash into Ethan's own chest. The ribbon with its tight, ugly knot still lay bagged on the kitchen counter. Ethan could almost feel the fabric cutting into his own fingers when he thought about it. He wanted to believe it was nothing. That maybe Orion was simply aging, his senses faltering, his instincts too sharp for a town this soft. But in his gut, Ethan knew better. He had seen too much to write off a child's cry in the dark. Still, hesitation gnawed at him. He had been wrong before. The memory of it returned now, uninvited. A case years back. A mother accused of harming her own son. He had believed the whispers, followed his hunch, pressed too hard. It had taken weeks to realize the boy's injuries were the result of a rare illness, not cruelty. Ethan had carried that mistake like a scar on his badge. He had promised himself he would never again let instinct drag him faster than truth. Now instinct wore fur and eyes the color of amber, and it stared at him every morning, demanding he choose. Ethan stood, pulling on his jacket. Orion watched him, tail still, ears pointed. The dog didn't beg for walks, he commanded them. Together, they stepped outside. The air was sharp, crisp with the kind of cold that warned winter wasn't far. Fairview Lane still slept, houses shuttered, chimneys quiet. Orion trotted ahead a few steps, nose low, reading the street as if each crack in the pavement held a story. At the Hale property, he slowed again, body angling, ears catching something Ethan couldn't. The leash tightened. Ethan followed his gaze to the windows glowing faintly in the early light, curtains drawn, no sign of life. "Not today," Ethan whispered, though the words were as much plea as command. Orion's eyes flicked up at him. No judgment, just that steady look, a reminder that instincts didn't bargain, they simply were. Ethan rubbed a hand over his face, fighting the old pull of habit. The detective in him wanted to knock on that door, flash a badge, demand answers. The widower in him wanted to retreat, to convince himself it was none of his concern. He felt Anna's absence like a voice that would have told him which path was right. Without her, all he had was the quiet push of a dog's growl in the night. As they moved on, Ethan realized he was already making a choice, whether he admitted it or not. He was paying attention again. His notebook lay open on the desk back home, with fresh ink on the page. Ribbon, cry, Hale, Selina Ward. His hand had written it before his head had allowed the thought. Old habits, it seemed, didn't die. They waited. They lingered in the corners until a sound in the dark reminded you who you used to be. And ghosts, they never left. They just changed their names. Ethan tightened his grip on the leash. Orion walked steady beside him, eyes forward, every step saying what Ethan could not yet. Something's wrong. Don't look away. The man hesitated. The dog did not. The bell over the door of Miller's diner jingled the same way it had for 40 years, cheerful, mechanical, unchanging. The booths were still red vinyl patched in places with tape that never matched the shade. And the smell of bacon grease lived in the walls like an old hymn that refused to stop being sung. For most of Silver Creek, the diner was the town's pulse. You came here to drink burnt coffee, to hear gossip packaged as casual remarks, to believe for an hour that nothing bad could reach you inside the clatter of dishes and the comfort of small talk. Ethan Cole slid into his usual corner booth, the one that let him keep his back against the wall. Old habits, he reminded himself. He told the waitress, "Black coffee," the way he always did, and she nodded, already walking toward the pot that never seemed empty. Orion lay at his feet, stretched, but alert. Service dogs were common enough in Silver Creek that no one looked twice anymore, though the regulars still lowered their voices when they noticed how the shepherd's ears flicked, how his eyes tracked movement with the calm suspicion of a soldier. The diner filled slowly this morning. Farmers in from the edge of town, a teacher grading papers between bites of toast, the sheriff's deputy running late. Voices floated over the tables, harmless in tone, until Ethan caught the edges of one conversation at the counter. Two women leaned close over their plates, coffee cups clutched like anchors. Their words came soft but sharp, the way gossip often does when it cuts deep. "That's the third one to quit," the first woman whispered. "Housekeepers don't just walk away from pay like that, not in this town." The second woman shook her head, her spoon tapping against the porcelain rim. "Margaret lasted 6 weeks, the one before her, barely 2 months, and nobody's seen the girl since." Ethan kept his eyes on the window. The steam fogged the glass just enough to make the street outside look like a memory. He didn't lean closer. He didn't need to. His ears, trained over years of interrogations, picked out each word as if it had been spoken for him alone. "The girl," the first woman repeated. "Clara. Sweet little thing. Used to play at the park all the time before her mother died." A pause, filled with the quiet scrape of a fork. Now, not a glimpse, not at church, not at school. It's like she vanished. Orion shifted beneath the table. Not restless, not impatient. A small movement, as if the sound of that name had brushed against something in him. Ethan's hand found the thick fur along his shoulder, grounding both of them. The waitress returned, set the coffee down. "Anything else?" Ethan shook his head. His voice was steady when he answered, "No thanks." But inside something was stirring. The gossip rolled on behind him. "They say Victor's not well," the second woman murmured. "Barely eats, barely sleeps. And that woman, Selena, always at the house. Sharp-tongued, someone said, 'I don't know what she is to him, but she's not family.'" The first woman leaned back, lowering her voice even more. "All I know is, it's not right. A child should be seen, should be heard. And no one has heard Clara in months." Ethan sipped his coffee, bitter and thin. He'd heard words like that before in other towns, whispered in other diners, where the wallpaper peeled and the stories people told themselves didn't match the truths hiding behind their walls. Missing. Vanished. Not right. He told himself not to let it in, not to let the ache of other people's sorrow stir his own. But the ribbon in his jacket pocket felt heavier than it had the night before, and the echo of that muffled cry seemed to ride on the voices at the counter. Orion lifted his head from the floor, eyes fixed on the two women. He wasn't growling. He wasn't restless. Just watching, as if he knew the weight of their words, even if he didn't understand the shape of them. His ears twitched with every mention of Clara's name. Ethan's gut tightened, He thought of the locked mansion, the polished windows that reflected everything except the truth inside. He thought of Selina Ward's smile that had never touched her eyes, and the necklace that looked too familiar to be chance. He thought of Victor Hale, once a man of genius, now a recluse drowning in grief, and of the child caught in the shadow of all that silence. The waitress passed again, topping off his coffee without asking. "Slow morning?" she said. "Yeah," Ethan replied, though his voice lacked conviction. His eyes followed the steam rising from the cup, the way it curled and vanished, just like voices that meant everything, but left no proof behind. The two women laughed then, a quick, nervous sound, as if to soften the sting of their own words. They paid their bill, left a few coins scattered on the counter, and walked out into the sunlight. The bell over the door jingled again. Ordinary, cheerful, blind. Ethan stayed seated long after, staring at the dark reflection in his coffee. Orion shifted closer, pressing against his boots, anchoring him in the present. There was no case file, no call to respond to. Nothing official bound him to the Hale house or the missing laughter of a little girl. All he had was a ribbon, a rumor, and a dog that refused to ignore what others couldn't hear. But sometimes that was enough. Sometimes that was where justice began. In the whispers people tried to dismiss. In the silences a dog refused to accept. Ethan drained the last of his coffee, left a bill on the table, and stood. The old floorboards groaned under his weight. Orion rose immediately, posture tall, eyes scanning the room one last time before they stepped into the bright morning. On the street, the town bustled as if nothing dark had ever dared to cross its borders. Children skipped rope on the corner. The postman whistled under his breath, but Ethan's chest felt heavier with each breath. Silver Creek might not have wanted to see what was happening inside the Hale mansion, but Orion had already seen it, heard it, felt it. And Ethan knew himself well enough to understand this. Once the thread of dread began to weave through him, he couldn't unweave it. He could only follow it, wherever it led. Ethan told himself he was only out for another walk. That was the story he carried with him as he turned down Fairview Lane again, Orion steady at his side, the leash slack between them like a thread of trust. But deep down, he knew it wasn't the whole truth. He was circling the Hale property, like a moth drawn back to the flame it couldn't ignore. The mansion stood immaculate, its columns glowing pale in the late afternoon sun, hedges trimmed so sharply they could have been measured by a ruler. To anyone else, it was a picture of discipline, of order. To Ethan, it was too perfect. Like a stage set where the props never shifted, the curtains never swayed. A place rehearsed to hide its flaws. Orion slowed before the gate, his body angling toward the house, nose lifted to the air. He didn't growl this time, but his posture said enough. He had not forgotten. Ethan felt the pull in his gut, half instinct, half memory of the ribbon sealed in a plastic bag back on his kitchen counter. "Easy," he murmured, though the reassurance was for himself more than the dog. He pushed open the iron gate and stepped onto the front walk. The gravel crunched beneath his boots. The silence of the property pressed around him. He had barely reached the porch when the door opened. She stood there, Selina Ward. Her presence filled the doorway like smoke. Tall, elegant, polished in a way that suggested money had never been a stranger to her. Her blouse was cream, tucked into charcoal slacks that fit with surgical precision. Her dark hair was pulled into a knot that bared the lines of her neck. Around that neck lay the detail that made Ethan's pulse tighten. A single strand of pearls, luminous, familiar. Anna had once worn pearls like those to a Christmas party, and more importantly, so had Victor Hale's late wife. Ethan had seen the photo in the Silver Creek Gazette, printed after the accident. The necklace wasn't simply similar, it looked identical. Selina's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Detective Cole, isn't it?" Her voice was smooth, practiced, as if she'd been waiting for him. Ethan tipped his head, neutral. "Ethan's fine. I live a few blocks over. Thought I'd stop by, check in on Victor. Haven't seen him around much." "Victor's resting," she said, the words clipped but polite. "Grief still weighs on him, as you can imagine." She leaned against the frame, hand resting lightly on the door as if to keep him outside without ever closing it. Orion sat beside Ethan, calm but coiled. His amber eyes locked on Selina with an intensity that made her shift ever so slightly on her heels. He didn't growl, didn't bark, just stared. The kind of stare that stripped away the polish and looked for what was underneath. Selina's gaze flicked downward, meeting his. "Beautiful animal," she said softly, though her tone was sharper than the words. "He thinks the same of you," Ethan replied, deadpan. It was half truth, half test, and he watched the corner of her mouth twitch. Behind her, the foyer gleamed with spotless wood floors, a chandelier suspended above like a frozen tear. The air smelled faintly of lavender cleaner and something else, metallic, sterile, the kind of scent that belonged more in hospitals than homes. Ethan's eyes caught the details without trying. No toys on the floor, no stray shoes, no sign a child lived there. "I used to serve with Victor," Ethan said. "Thought I'd say hello, see how he's holding up." Selina tilted her head. "That's thoughtful. But he isn't receiving visitors at the moment. He needs peace, not reminders of the past." The words sat too neatly, like lines rehearsed. Ethan studied her face, the precision of her smile, the calm steel in her eyes. It wasn't hostility, it was control. She radiated the kind of confidence that comes from believing she owned the narrative. "Of course," Ethan said lightly. "I understand." He let the silence stretch. People uncomfortable with silence usually filled it. Selina didn't. She held it, as if daring him to speak first. Orion shifted, his body pressing closer to Ethan's leg. The leash quivered with tension, not from pulling, but from restraint. His focus never broke from Selina's necklace. Ethan noticed it again, the way the pearls caught the light. He thought of Victor's wife wearing them in that old photograph, her hand on Clara's shoulder, both smiling as if the world still made sense. And now here they were, hanging around the neck of a stranger who had stepped into the house like she'd always belonged. Ethan's jaw tightened. He forced it to loosen before she saw. "Well," he said finally, "tell Victor I stopped by. No rush. I'll pass along your message." Selina's smile deepened by a fraction. "Good to see the town's looking out for him." "Always," Ethan replied. His hand brushed Orion's head. "Come on, partner." As he turned, Selina's voice followed. "Detective?" He glanced back. Her eyes glinted, sharp as glass. "Some wounds take longer than others to close. Best to let them heal without picking at them." It sounded like advice. It felt like a warning. Ethan gave her nothing in return. No nod, no smile. He simply walked off the porch. Orion lingered a second longer, staring before obeying. The door closed behind them, with the soft finality of a lid being set over a box. At the end of the walkway, Ethan paused, the evening air cool against his face. He looked back once at the mansion. The curtains in the upstairs window shifted. Not much, just enough for a shadow to retreat. A child's hand, perhaps, or maybe just the wind. Orion gave a low, quiet whine. Ethan reached down, scratched behind his ear. "I saw it too," he whispered. They walked back toward the heart of Silver Creek, but the weight of the pearls lingered in Ethan's mind. So did the ribbon. So did the muffled cry. Each piece is small, deniable on its own. But together, they were starting to feel like a pattern, a picture Ethan had seen too many times in other lives, other houses, other cases. And if Orion was right, and he usually was, this house was hiding something worth fearing. The next time Ethan found himself on Fairview Lane, it wasn't by accident. He told himself he was simply walking Orion, stretching the dog's legs before dusk settled. But he knew he was circling back to the Hale mansion, with intent he didn't want to name. The ribbon weighed on his thoughts. Selena's cool smile gnawed at him, and Orion, steady, patient Orion, hadn't stopped glancing down this street for days, as if the dog's compass was fixed on the house that didn't want to be seen. Tonight, the mansion's windows glowed faintly golden against the gray sky, but the light felt wrong, hollow, like stage lamps illuminating a set no one truly lived in. The hedges were trimmed, the lawn perfect, the flag motionless. A portrait of order, but order could be the cruelest disguise. Ethan pressed the gate latch and stepped onto the walk. Gravel shifted beneath his boots. Orion padded silently beside him, tail low, ears pointed. The shepherd had that posture again. Not aggressive, not restless, but alert, like a soldier walking point through uncertain terrain. Before Ethan reached the door, it opened. This time, it wasn't Selena who stood there. Victor Hale. The man was a ghost of the photographs Ethan remembered. Once sharp-featured and confident, Victor now looked worn thin by grief and something heavier. His salt and pepper hair was unkempt, his beard uneven. His skin had the pallor of someone who'd forgotten sunlight mattered. His sweatshirt hung loose on his frame, as if even clothing had given up clinging to him. "Ethan," Victor said, his voice cracked and tired. "Didn't expect visitors." Ethan offered a small nod. "Just thought I'd check in. It's been a while." Victor hesitated, then stepped aside. "Come in." The foyer welcomed him with complete silence, too complete. Polished floors gleamed, every surface immaculate, not a speck of dust in sight. The chandelier overhead sparkled with cold light. On the walls hung framed photographs, but too few of them, and one space was conspicuously empty, dust outlining where something had once been. The air smelled faintly of lavender, cleaner again. Sharp, sterile. A scent that belonged more in a clinic than a home. Ethan's gut tightened. Homes were supposed to smell like life. Food, books, children's crayons, even the mess of living. This place smelled like someone had scrubbed it of all evidence that people existed inside. Victor walked stiffly toward the sitting room. "I don't get out much these days." His hand trembled slightly as he poured coffee into a porcelain cup that looked unused. "Selena takes care of most things now." Ethan followed, Orion moving with him like a shadow. The dog's nose twitched, reading the air, his paws whispering against the rug. "Grief can bury a man," Victor said, staring into the dark liquid before setting the cup aside untouched. "You think you found the bottom of it, and then it opens deeper. Clara's been His words stopped. He shook his head. She's quiet. Withdrawn. Ethan kept his expression neutral, though inside his thoughts were a storm. Withdrawn was the word people used when children were hurting in ways no one wanted to confront. Orion drifted toward the hallway, his nose skimming the polished floor, body tense. Ethan watched as the dog slowed at a long white door at the end of the hall, one trimmed with shiny brass hardware. Orion sniffed hard, pawed once, then again, claws tapping against the wood. His ears tilted, his body stiffened, and he sat facing the door, eyes locked, a low vibration building in his chest. Ethan's throat tightened. Victor noticed. "Storage," he said quickly, too quickly. He forced a chuckle that died halfway. "Old basement access. It's locked for safety. Nothing down there but dust." But his hand, the way it twitched at his side, the way his eyes flicked toward the door and then away, betrayed him. Ethan crouched beside Orion, hand on the shepherd's shoulders. The dog's body was taut as wire, every muscle saying what Ethan already felt. "He's usually quiet," Ethan murmured. "Doesn't fuss over nothing." Victor's jaw worked. Dogs smell all sorts of things. Rodents, mold, who knows? His tone tried for dismissive, but his voice carried the brittle edge of a man hiding something. Ethan didn't press, not yet. He had no warrant, no right to push. He had only instinct, and instinct wasn't enough to force open a locked door in a house like this. Orion's stare didn't move. He stayed planted, every line of his body refusing to accept Victor's words. His tail was still, his breath sharp, his silence louder than any bark. Ethan rose slowly, letting his hand linger on the dog's fur. He looked back at Victor. The man seemed smaller in the grand hallway, shoulders hunched under an invisible weight. His grief was real. Ethan could see that. But grief wasn't the only thing living in this house. "Maybe you're right," Ethan said, voice careful. "Dogs pick up things we can't. Doesn't always mean trouble." Victor nodded quickly, relief too visible in his eyes. "Exactly." But Ethan knew better. He had seen too many locked doors, too many nervous glances. Truth had a way of hiding in plain sight, waiting for the right question to break it open. Orion whined once, low and soft, his gaze still fixed on the door. Ethan squeezed the leash in his hand, a silent promise to the dog and to himself. Not tonight, but soon. He turned back to Victor, forcing a small smile. "Appreciate the coffee. I'll let you rest." Victor looked almost grateful, like a man spared a battle he wasn't ready to fight. He muttered something about stopping by again sometime, then ushered Ethan toward the door. As the heavy wood closed behind him, Ethan breathed deep, the cool evening air cutting away the sterile smell of lavender and metal. Orion stood beside him on the porch, ears still tilted back toward the house. The mansion glowed against the dusk, serene, polished, untouchable. But Ethan knew better. Houses don't hum with tension unless something inside them is wrong. And tonight, he had seen it plain. Not just in Orion's reaction, but in Victor Hale's eyes, hollowed by more than grief. They walked away, gravel crunching underfoot. At the end of the lane, Ethan stopped and looked back once. The curtains in the upstairs window shifted again, just slightly, as if someone had been watching all along. Orion pressed against his leg, silent but certain. Ethan whispered, "Yeah, I saw it too." And together they walked into the gathering dark, the locked door still echoing behind them. Word count: 1015. This scene brings Victor into the story for the first time, frail, broken, and overshadowed by Selena's control. It emphasizes the sterile, unnatural feel of the mansion, Orion's powerful reaction to the locked basement door, and Victor's nervous attempt to dismiss it. The sitting room looked like a page torn from a glossy magazine. Perfect angles, tasteful decor, everything arranged to impress. Yet it felt airless, as though the walls themselves had been taught to hold their breath. Ethan sat in an armchair that was too stiff to be comfortable. Orion stretched at his feet, but not resting, his head lifted, and his ears pricked forward. Victor Hale lowered himself onto the couch across from him, hands clasped tight, as though afraid they might shake if left alone. While his shoulders slumped in defeat, his eyes dull, carrying the exhaustion of a man who hadn't slept through the night in months. He began to speak, something about the difficulty of balancing grief with fatherhood, but his voice faltered halfway, breaking into a nervous cough. Before he could recover, she appeared. Selena Ward. She moved into the room like she owned the air, a grey tailored suit, hair sleek and pinned, the familiar strand of pearls gleaming at her throat. She carried no tray, no drink, no gesture of hospitality. Only herself, and that was enough to shift the room's gravity. "Victor," she said, crisp as the snap of glass. "You shouldn't be troubling Detective Cole with personal matters. It isn't good for you." Victor's mouth opened, then closed. He stared down at his hands. Ethan watched the exchange in silence, noting the way Victor shrank just a little under her voice. Not openly submissive, but trained by repetition, like a man who had learned that resistance only earned him sharper words later. "I was just—" Victor began. "Resting," Selena cut in smoothly, finishing his sentence for him. "That's what you need, not dragging yourself into conversations that upset you." The dismissal was gentle on the surface, but the edge beneath it was razor-sharp. Ethan caught it. Orion caught it too. The shepherd shifted, nose twitching as Selena crossed the room. She smelled faintly of lavender, but beneath it lingered something sharper, metallic, like iron left too long in the rain. Orion's lips curled, barely, a low growl vibrating deep in his chest. Selena stopped. Her eyes flicked to the dog, then to Ethan. "He doesn't like me." "He doesn't dislike anyone without reason," Ethan said quietly, his hand brushing Orion's fur to calm him. Her smile was practiced, unbothered. "Dogs are unpredictable. You never quite know what goes on in their heads." Ethan held her gaze. "Sometimes they know what goes on in ours better than we do." Something flickered in her expression. Annoyance. Quickly buried. She turned back to Victor, her hand brushing his shoulder in a gesture that looked affectionate, but pressed down just a shade too firmly. "Why don't you go rest upstairs? I'll speak with Detective Cole." Victor hesitated, his eyes darting toward Ethan. For a brief second, there was a silent plea there, a flash of something human beneath the exhaustion. Then it was gone. He rose slowly, muttered something about being tired, and retreated toward the staircase. His steps were heavy, reluctant, like a man walking into a cell of his own making. Selena watched him go, her smile pinned in place. Only when he vanished from sight did she turn back to Ethan. "He's been fragile since the accident, easily swayed. Sometimes he says things that sound unwell. I trust you'll understand." The words weren't explanations. They were control disguised as concern. Ethan had heard tones like that before, from suspects who tried to bend a narrative before it had even been asked for. "I understand grief," Ethan said carefully. It does strange things to a man. Yes, she replied, tilting her head. Which is why we protect him, shield him from undue stress. Don't you agree? The phrasing snagged at him. We protected him. Who were we? Her, or her and someone else? Orion's growl deepened, low and steady now, not the quick burst of surprise, but the kind of sound that came from certainty. His body angled toward her, muscles taut, tail stiff. Ethan steadied him with a touch, but he didn't quiet him. Some warnings were worth hearing. Selina moved closer, pretending not to notice. Her perfume mingled with the metallic tang that clung to her like a hidden blade. He needs allies, Detective. People who let him heal rather than drag him back into pain. If you care for him, as you say, you'll respect that. Ethan rose from his chair, every instinct warning him not to linger. I'll keep that in mind. She inclined her head, satisfied. Good. You're welcome any time, of course. But short visits are best, for Victor's sake. Ethan's eyes traveled once more across the room. The sterile surfaces, the empty space on the wall where a photograph had once hung, the absence of anything that hinted a child lived here. No toys, no drawings, no stray shoes by the door, only silence, rehearsed and polished. He turned to leave. Orion didn't move until Selina stepped back, granting them passage. As they crossed the threshold, Ethan caught one last detail. At the base of the stairs, on the lowest step, a faint smear of pink thread, like a ribbon caught and torn. He tucked the image into his mind, the way detectives do with things they cannot yet name. Outside, the air was cooler, cleaner. Orion shook himself once, as if shedding the weight of the house's stifling air. Ethan breathed deep, his chest tightening. Clara's absence was no longer rumor. It was a shadow that pressed at every corner of that mansion, a silence that had teeth. He looked back at the house, its white columns glowing against the evening. Beautiful, polished, deceitful. Beside him, Orion stood rigid, ears angled back toward the door, as if he knew what lay behind it. Ethan laid a hand on his dog's head, his voice low, meant only for the two of them. We're not walking away from this, are we? Orion didn't move, didn't blink. The silence was his answer. The Hale mansion carried its silence like a second skin. Ethan could feel it pressing close around him as Selina escorted him back toward the foyer. The air was too still, too scrubbed, as though sound itself had been polished away. He walked slow, Orion keeping pace at his heel, the shepherd's eyes scanning every angle of the hallway. Ethan's gaze moved across the walls. Rows of framed photographs stretched in careful order. Victor's company ribbon cutting, charity galas, a family trip to the coast. But as they passed the hallway table beneath the chandelier, he noticed something small, yet sharp enough to cut through the calm. An empty space. One frame was missing. The wall bore its shadow in dust, a clean rectangle where a photo had once hung. It wasn't obvious at first glance. Selina had arranged other frames to cover the gap, a vase of lilies set deliberately beneath it, but the outline was unmistakable to a detective's eye. Years of habit trained him to read absences as loudly as presences. He slowed just a step, enough to let the silence press the detail deeper into his mind. What photo had been there, and why remove it? Selina's voice floated back to him. Victor's been fragile. We've had to tidy away a few reminders. Best not to linger on the past. It was delivered casually, but Ethan knew rehearsed words when he heard them. He nodded as if satisfied, though his chest tightened. Orion's pace shifted, his nails clicking faintly against the hardwood. The dog wasn't staring at the wall. He was fixed on the long white door at the end of the hallway. The same door Victor had dismissed as storage. His entire body leaned toward it, taut as a drawn bow. Ethan tried to keep his stride even, but Orion pulled once, twice, then froze. Nose pointed at the seam of the doorframe. A growl, low and steady, rumbled from his chest. It wasn't the bark of surprise, but the certainty of recognition. Selina stopped, turning just enough to notice. Her smile cooled. "Basement," she said quickly. "Unfinished. Not safe for visitors. Best keep him away." Ethan crouched, laying a hand on Orion's shoulders. The shepherd didn't break his stare. His entire body radiated tension. Ethan felt the vibration of the growl through his palm. "Come on, boy," he murmured, tugging gently at the leash. Orion resisted, claws scraping faintly against the polished floor. His ears flicked forward, straining. Then, beneath the silence, it came. A sound. Faint, muffled, barely there. But Ethan heard it, softer than a heartbeat, sharper than memory. A thud. Not the creak of settling wood or the sigh of pipes. A sound too deliberate. Like something, or someone, shifting on the other side of that locked door. Ethan's blood ran cold. Selina moved swiftly, stepping between them and the door with a poise that looked effortless, but carried the urgency of defense. "This way, detective. I'll see you out." Her tone was final, dismissive, but her eyes betrayed the flicker of something sharper. Panic, quickly caged. Ethan forced a thin smile. "Of course." He rose, easing Orion back. The shepherd's body was rigid, tail stiff, but he obeyed. His growl sank back into silence, though his eyes never left the door until Selina ushered them past. At the threshold, Ethan turned once more, letting his gaze linger on the empty frame space, the dust outlines stark in the golden light. Then he glanced back down the hall, where the locked door waited in its pristine paint, pretending to be nothing more than storage. But he had heard the sound, and Orion had known it before he did. On the porch, Selina's smile returned, perfectly practiced. "Do come again, detective. Victor values old friends. Short visits, though, best for his health." Ethan tipped his head. "I'll keep that in mind." The door closed with a soft click, leaving him and Orion in the cool evening air. For a long moment, Ethan stood on the steps, staring at the columns glowing against the twilight. The mansion looked flawless, untouched. To any passerby, it was simply a house where grief lived quietly. But Ethan knew better now. The silence inside wasn't grief. It was something else. Something hiding. Orion pressed against his leg, letting out a sharp exhale through his nose, a dog's version of refusal. Ethan reached down, scratching behind his ears. "I know," he murmured. "I heard it too." The leash hung loose in his hand as they walked down the gravel path, but every step felt heavy. Behind him, the mansion watched with its spotless windows, reflecting the world while keeping its secrets locked away. And in Ethan's mind, the sound replayed, a faint thud from behind a door that should have held nothing but dust. It was the first undeniable clue, and it left him colder than any silence ever had. The decision to return was not one Ethan Cole made lightly. Every instinct told him he was pressing too close to a line he'd sworn never to cross again. Yet the sound he'd heard behind that locked door refused to fade. A muffled thud, deliberate, carried in his memory like a wound. For 3 nights he lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Orion curled at the foot of the bed. The shepherd's breathing was steady, but Ethan's mind kept replaying that sound until he knew he couldn't leave it alone. He prepared like a soldier, recorder disguised as a smoke detector, fresh batteries, tools to mount it fast. The hardest part was inventing a reason to step inside the Hale mansion again. Orion sensed it before Ethan clipped the leash. The shepherd paced, restless, his body taut with the same readiness Ethan remembered from deployment. "You're my distraction tonight," Ethan murmured, tightening the harness. Orion's amber eyes met his, steady, as if to agree. They left at dusk, the Hale mansion glowing white against the evening, like a set, waiting for its actors. Selina opened the door, pearls glinting at her throat. "Detective," she said smoothly. "Twice in 1 week?" Ethan gestured to Orion, who pawed at the porch. "He dragged me here. Thought I'd say hello to Victor." Her gaze flicked to the dog, then back to Ethan. "Persistent animal." "Persistence saves lives," he said. After a pause, she stepped aside. Inside, the air reeked faintly of lavender cleaner, with something metallic beneath. Victor appeared, his face drawn but polite. "Didn't expect company," he murmured. Orion was restless, Ethan replied casually. The shepherd moved with purpose, circling, pawing at a chair leg. As Ethan bent to calm him, he slipped the recorder free, fixing it beneath the fireplace mantel with one practiced motion. Magnetic. Secure. He smoothed Orion's fur to buy a second to check. The device vanished into the shadows. Selina's eyes narrowed. "Well-trained, detective. He knows his place." "Sometimes I think he trains me." Her smile was thin. Behind her, Victor shifted uneasily, his eyes flicking toward the staircase. A few strained pleasantries, and Ethan excused himself. Selina closed the door softly, the sound lingering like a verdict. Back at home, Ethan poured coffee he didn't want, the receiver glowing faintly on the table. Orion pressed close, head on his boot, ears pricked forward. For hours the mansion whispered only footsteps and creaks. Exhaustion tugged at Ethan, doubts circling. Maybe it had only been the house settling. Then, past midnight, the silence cracked. Selina's voice, sharp, commanding. "You don't speak unless I say so." Ethan froze, leaning closer. Orion stiffened too, eyes fixed on the device. A faint sob followed, small, stifled, childlike. Ethan's throat closed. "Clara." Selina's tone sharpened, cruel. "You miss your mother. She's ashes now. Want me to scatter her on the curb?" The sob broke into silence. Ethan pressed his palms against the table, every muscle taut. Orion growled low, not alarm, but solidarity. On the tape, Selina again. "Quiet, or you'll never see daylight." The sob vanished into swallowed silence. Ethan shut his eyes. He'd seen soldiers broken in interrogation rooms, men stripped of hope. But a child being taught her own voice was dangerous. It cut deeper than anything he'd carried back from war. He opened his eyes. "God help me," he whispered. Orion rose, pressing against his leg. The shepherd's presence was steady, eyes unblinking. Ethan realized the dog had always known. The growls at the locked door, the stiff posture. Orion had been warning him all along. No more hesitation. Ethan leaned forward, listening again. Clara wasn't just missing. She was trapped, terrorized behind those flawless white columns. His grief, once paralyzing, hardened into purpose. He looked at Orion. The shepherd's gaze burned with certainty. Ethan nodded. "We're not walking away." The house grew still, but Ethan couldn't rest. The lamp on his desk cast a weary glow over untouched papers and a mug of cold coffee. Selina's cruelty replayed in his head, Clara's sob echoing with each tick of the clock. Two voices warred in him. The detective who lived by procedure. No warrant, no entry. Evidence must be admissible. And the soldier who knew hesitation killed. If he waited for approval, Clara might not survive the silence. He rubbed his jaw, rough with stubble. Anna's face flickered in memory. Her laugh, her faith in his principles. For years, he'd clung to the law because it was all he had left of her. But now he understood the brutal truth. If he chose the law over Clara, he might be choosing silence over her life. Orion padded across the floor, pressing against him. His eyes glowed steady, waiting for Ethan to accept what was already decided. "You heard her too," Ethan murmured. "You knew before I did." The shepherd's gaze didn't waver. Ethan pulled his journal close, hand steady. No warrant. No authorization. Just instinct. If this fails, I'll carry it alone. But if it saves her, it's worth everything. He set the pen down and exhaled. The silence of the house no longer felt haunted. It was determined. Orion laid his head on Ethan's knee, his body coiled with the same vow Ethan now spoke aloud. "We're going to get her out." Outside, Silver Creek slept. Lawns gleamed faintly under streetlights. Porches stood quiet, blinds drawn. To the town, nothing was wrong. But in the Hale mansion on Fairview Lane, a little girl's sobs were being swallowed by walls too thick for anyone else to hear, except for a shepherd who wouldn't stop listening, and a man who could no longer ignore him. The following week, Silver Creek looked ordinary. Maple leaves scattered, children pedaled past, neighbors waved from porches. Nothing suggested the storm gathering behind the white pillars of the Hale mansion. But Ethan Cole knew danger rarely came with sirens. It crept in quietly, dressed in suits and smiles. That afternoon, he parked 2 blocks away, Orion alert in the passenger seat. The shepherd's ears pricked forward, his body taut. Then came the sound, a sleek engine purring down Fairview Lane. A black sedan eased to the gates. Out stepped Richard Hale. Years had passed since Ethan last saw him, but Richard looked untouched by grief. Tanned, tailored, carrying a gift bag wrapped in tissue that screamed status. Orion growled low, his hackles lifting. Ethan didn't hush him. Through binoculars, Ethan watched Selina greet Richard with a kiss, her laugh startlingly genuine. They weren't acquaintances. They were allies. Wolves circling Victor, frail and grieving. Ethan wrote in his notebook, "Selina plus Richard ill strategy. Victor absent. Clara leverage." That night, the recorder confirmed it. Richard's smooth voice. "If we're going to secure Clara's guardianship, we need signatures before the quarter ends." Selina's reply. "Dr. Manning will certify Victor unfit. Once papers are filed, the transfer will look inevitable." Ethan's pen tore the page. Conditioned. That was the word Selina used. They were proud of breaking Clara into silence. Richard added coldly, "With her under our name, the estate follows. Then she disappears." Orion barked once, sharp as a command. Ethan met his eyes. The shepherd's body vibrated with the same vow Ethan felt burning inside him. "We won't let it happen," he whispered. A few nights later, Ethan walked Orion down Fairview Lane under the guise of routine. The mansion glowed, pristine, yet wrongness pressed at him with each step. Orion stiffened, growling low, eyes locked on the porch. And then Ethan saw her, Clara. She stood in the porch light, small and fragile, swallowed by a sweatshirt too big. Pale, barefoot, hair unbrushed, a ghost of a child. Her eyes fixed on Orion, as if he were the only real thing in her world. Slowly, she raised her hand, pressed a finger to her lips. The gesture cut through Ethan like a blade. Not playful, desperate. A plea carved out of silence. "Don't speak. Don't expose me." Then, the shadow shifted. Selina appeared in the doorway, her smile sugar-laced poison. "Clara, what are you doing out here? You'll catch a cold." The girl flinched, hand falling, retreating inside without a word. Orion rumbled deep, his body angled toward the door even as Clara vanished. Selina's gaze swept the yard. She spotted Ethan, standing at the far end of the sidewalk. Her smile widened, sharp as glass. She raised a hand in mock greeting. Ethan tipped his head, neutral. His heart hammered so loud he thought she might hear it. He tugged Orion forward, moving past before the shepherd's growl broke loose. When they turned the corner, Ethan stopped. He crouched beside Orion, gripping the harness. His voice was raw. "She's in there. She's alive. And she's begging us not to give her away." Orion pressed his head to Ethan's chest, steady, solid. The shepherd's presence said what Ethan already knew. Wait, watch, but don't walk away. The road ahead wasn't about suspicion anymore. It was about Clara, the fragile child who had begged with silence for someone to hear her. Ethan rose, fists clenched, gaze hard toward the mansion cloaked in night. "We'll get her out," he vowed. Orion growled low, not in threat, but in promise. The knock came well past midnight. Ethan Cole had been sitting in the living room, a file open across his knees, Orion stretched on the rug. The knock was soft, hesitant, the kind made by someone unsure if they wanted the door opened at all. Orion's ears flicked first. He was on his feet before Ethan rose, body angled toward the sound. When Ethan opened the door, the porch light revealed Victor Hale. He looked nothing like the confident businessman Silver Creek once admired. His clothes hung loose, his beard uneven, his eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion. "Victor," Ethan said quietly, "what are you doing here?" Victor glanced over his shoulder before whispering, I couldn't stay in that house tonight. She's..." His voice broke. "Can I come in?" Inside, Victor collapsed into the armchair, shoulders bowed. For a long moment he said nothing, rubbing his temple with trembling fingers. Then his voice cracked. "Selina, she says she's helping me, that I'm not fit to raise Clara alone. And maybe she's right. Some nights I swear I hear Clara crying, but Selina tells me it's just the wind in the vents. She makes me doubt my own memory." Ethan clenched his hands. Gaslighting. Textbook. He leaned forward. "You're not losing your mind, Victor. You're being manipulated. And Clara, she's not just grieving, she's scared. You've felt it." Victor buried his face in his hands. "Richard's back, and they're circling me. I signed something last week, and I don't even remember what it was. I'm handing my daughter away piece by piece." Orion whined and pressed his head against Victor's knee. For a moment, the man's breathing slowed. Ethan lowered his voice. "You came here because you know the truth. Don't collapse now. If you resist, if you stand firm, we can bring them down." Victor's lips trembled. I don't know how much strength I have left. Then borrow mine, Ethan said. He motioned toward Orion. Borrow his. Victor let out a shaky laugh. A dog has more courage than I do. No, he just listens to instincts you've been taught to ignore. You still have them. That's why you're here. Victor lifted his head, eyes wet. If I stand against her, will Clara be safe? Ethan's answer was immediate. Not just safe, free. For the first time that night, something flickered in Victor's expression. Fragile, but real. Hope. The next morning, clouds pressed low over Silver Creek. Ethan walked Orion down Fairview Lane under the guise of a routine stroll. The mansion loomed at the end, its white pillars bright against the gloom. To neighbors, it was the jewel of the street. To Ethan, it was a fortress of silence. Orion's pace slowed. His nose twitched. Then he veered toward a flower bed along the side wall. The soil was freshly turned, darker than the rest. He began pawing furiously. Easy, boy. Ethan crouched, but Orion dug harder until his claws struck something solid. A small wooden box, wrapped in plastic, emerged from the dirt. Heart pounding, Ethan pulled it free and opened the lid. Inside lay a single crayon drawing. A stick-figure girl stood behind thick black bars. Her hair was yellow, her eyes wide and blue. Where her mouth should have been, there was nothing. Beside her stood a large dog, drawn in black and brown, standing guard between her and two shadowy figures reaching from outside the bars. Ethan's throat tightened. "My God," he whispered. Orion nosed the page, whining softly, as if recognizing himself in the crude strokes. "She drew you," Ethan murmured, voice shaking. "She drew you as the one keeping her safe." He folded the drawing carefully, slipping it into his notebook like a sacred relic. This wasn't just art, it was testimony. A voice smuggled through wax and paper because no one else had listened. No one but Orion. That evening, Ethan walked into the sheriff's office with Orion at his side and the box under his arm. Sheriff Frank Dalton looked up from his desk, spectacles perched on his nose. "Cole," he said, frowning. "You look like a man who hasn't slept in a week." "Try 7 days," Ethan replied, setting the box gently on the desk. "I need you to see this." Dalton opened it, unfolded the drawing, and studied it for a long moment. Finally, he whispered, "Lord have mercy." "She buried it in the yard," Ethan said. "Orion found it. That little girl doesn't have a voice right now, but she's screaming the only way she knows how." Dalton sighed. "It won't hold in court, Ethan. A child's sketch isn't evidence." "I don't care about the court," Ethan snapped. "I've got recordings of Selena threatening her. Richard talking about guardianship like she's property. And now this. How much more proof do we need before we act?" Dalton's eyes narrowed. "Recordings? You've been running surveillance?" "Yes." "Without a warrant?" Ethan's voice was sharp. "Would you have signed one on a hunch and a dog's growl? If I'd waited, Clara might already be gone." The office went still. Dalton studied him, the tired detective, fury burning in his voice, the shepherd bristling with protective instinct. At last, Dalton leaned back. "You've always been reckless, Cole, but you've never been wrong about a child in danger." Relief flickered in Ethan's chest. Dalton tapped the drawing. "This won't win in court, but it's enough for me to believe you. If you've got recordings, we can build a case. We just need to be smart. Catch them on record making threats they can't spin. Corner them until the judge has no choice." Ethan nodded grimly. Victor's braking. If we wait too long, he'll sign whatever they put in front of him. Then we don't wait too long, Dalton said. But we don't storm in blind either. Bring me one more piece, something undeniable. Then we end this. Ethan rose, Orion steady at his side. As he reached the door, Dalton called after him. Cole, he turned. The sheriff's gaze was steady. Trust that dog of yours. He's your compass. Outside, the night air was cold, rain threatening. Ethan laid a hand on Orion's neck, feeling the steady strength beneath the fur. For the first time, he wasn't alone. The circle of silence around Clara was starting to break, and once cracks spread, there was no putting the wall back together. The clock ticked past midnight, each second grinding into Ethan Cole's nerves. The lamp over his desk cast a tired glow across scattered tapes and a battered notebook. Orion paced the floor, claws tapping softly, his body wound tight. Sheriff Dalton sat opposite, arms folded. His lined face was grave, but fire still burned in his eyes. Together they listened again, Selena's voice slithering through static. You miss your mommy? She's ashes now. Do you want me to scatter them on the curb? Then Clara's faint sob. Ethan's hand clenched. He stopped the tape. The silence that followed was heavier than gunfire. Dalton leaned forward. We've got them. But if we move sloppily, they'll spin it. Victor unstable. You are a rogue cop. We need them to damn themselves where no lawyer can save them. Ethan nodded. So we set the stage. Dinner. Let them think they've won. From the corner, Orion gave a sharp bark, one note, decisive. Dalton half smiled. Looks like he voted action. Ethan's voice was flat. He's been ready since that first night. The Hale mansion glowed the next evening like a magazine spread. Curtains drawn, chandeliers blazing. Inside, the mahogany table gleamed beneath crystal light. Selena, in crimson silk and pearls, presided at the head like a queen. Richard lounged beside her, all charm and confidence. Victor sat hunched at the far side, pale and hollow. And Clara, small, swallowed in an oversized sweater, curled at the table's edge, her braid loose over one shoulder, her eyes fixed on her lap. Ethan kept his face neutral, a guest among wolves. Beneath the table, Orion lay stretched, muscles coiled, though his body looked calm. Selena lifted her glass. To my family. To the future. Richard echoed. To new beginnings. Victor's hand trembled as he raised his glass. Clara didn't move. The meal dragged with shallow laughter. Ethan answered questions about the weather. Richard bragged about Silver Creek. But beneath it all, tension thickened. Then Richard reached into his briefcase, withdrew a slim folder, and slid it before Victor. Just a formality. Guardianship adjustments, financial oversight. For stability. Victor's hand hovered, his eyes darting to Selena. She laid her hand over his, her smile sweet to outsiders, but sharpened for those who knew. Do it for Clara. Don't you want peace? Ethan's jaw tightened. Beneath the table, his hand brushed Orion's fur. The shepherd shifted closer. For the first time that evening, Clara lifted her eyes. They flicked to Ethan, then dropped. Under the table, her small toes nudged Orion's paw. The dog stilled, ears flicking. He had caught the signal. Richard slid a pen across the table. Just a signature, brother. Victor's breath came shallow. His fingers shook above the page. Selena's voice dripped sugar. One stroke, and the burden lifts. And then Clara moved. Slowly, desperately. She lifted her hand and pressed a finger to her lips. Ethan's throat constricted. Orion gave a low whine, nearly silent. Clara's plea cut sharper than any scream. Selina nudged the pen closer. Now Victor. Victor's hand trembled. His eyes flicked to Ethan. For 1 second, Ethan let the mask slip. His gaze said what words could not. You're not alone. The chandelier flickered. The house itself seemed to hold its breath. Ethan reached into his jacket, pulled out a small recorder, and set it on the table. The candlelight glinted off its buttons. Selina froze. Richard's grin stiffened. With a click, Selina's voice filled the room. You miss your mommy? She's ashes now. Victor's glass slipped, shattering on the rug. Clara flinched, pressing her hands to her ears. Ethan pressed play again. Richard's voice oozed. Victor hasn't woken up in years. Once the courts agree, the girl is ours. The words struck like gunfire. Victor recoiled, chest heaving. Clara wept silently, her shoulders shaking. Selina's mask cracked. With a scream, she lunged across the table, not at Ethan, not at Victor, but at Clara. The child froze, but Orion was already moving. With a roar that shook the room, the shepherd leapt, body slamming between predator and child. His teeth bared inches from Selina's wrist, his growl thunderous. Clara ducked beneath his chest, clutching his fur as Selina shrieked. And then the door burst open. "Sheriff's Department! Don't move!" Dalton stormed in with deputies at his back, badges flashing in the chandelier light. Chaos exploded, Selina thrashing, Richard shouting about illegality, deputies pinning them in cuffs. Silverware clattered, chairs toppled, the mask of perfection ripped apart. Victor sagged in his chair, his hands shaking. Clara buried her face in Orion's coat, sobbing. The dog lowered himself, pressing close, shielding her still. Ethan knelt beside them. "It's over, Clara. You're safe." She didn't answer, but her fists clung tighter to Orion's fur. Dalton's voice carried, hard as steel. This house hid too many lies. Tonight, the truth walked out in cuffs. Outside, red and blue lights washed across the white pillars. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains, whispers already rising. The Hale mansion's illusion was broken. Inside, Clara clung to Orion. Her silent plea finally answered. He had been her shield in silence. Now, in freedom, he would remain her guardian. The storm of the raid left a silence so heavy, it pressed down on the walls of the Hale mansion. The dining room lay in ruin. Wine spilled across linen like blood, shards of glass glittering on the rug, the guardianship papers curling untouched in the candlelight. From the foyer came muffled echoes, boots, handcuffs, Selina's venomous shrieks, Richard's stunned silence. Victor sat slumped at the table, hollowed, his hands trembling against his face. Months of grief and manipulation collapsed into sobs that shook his chest. Across the floor, Clara clung to Orion. She hadn't let anyone touch her, not even Ethan. Her fists tangled in the shepherd's coat, her face buried in his fur. Orion did not move, his steady breathing anchoring her in a world that had shifted beneath her feet. Ethan crouched beside them. His hand rested lightly on Clara's back, but his eyes stayed on Victor. "She's safe now," Ethan said softly. Victor lowered his hands, his eyes, raw with tears, fixed on his daughter. For a moment he didn't move, afraid she might vanish if he reached out. "I let this happen," he whispered. "No," Ethan cut in firmly. "They twisted your grief into chains, but you're still her father. And you stood up before it was too late." Victor's hand trembled toward Clara. At first she didn't move, but then her small fingers loosened just enough for his hand to rest over hers. The gesture broke him open. His sobs poured out, his forehead pressing to her knuckles. Ethan gripped his shoulder. Your love kept her alive long enough for us to reach her. Now you can rebuild. Clara stirred. She peeked up from Orion's fur, her blue eyes wet, and lifted one hand toward her father. A fragile ray of light broke the storm. Victor caught it, pressed it to his cheek, and closed his eyes as though clinging to life itself. From the hallway, Sheriff Dalton reappeared, voice steady. They're in custody. The DA's already on call. This won't get buried. Ethan nodded. Then get Victor and Clara out of here tonight. They can't stay another hour. Dalton agreed. Ethan looked once more at Clara. She was still pressed into Orion, but the iron grip of terror was loosening. He whispered to his partner, You did it. You brought her through. Orion's ears flicked, tail thumping once against the rug. 2 weeks later, Victor and Clara were settled in a rented cottage at the edge of town. The pines whispered at night. The air smelled of wood smoke instead of fear, and the silence inside was warm rather than suffocating. It was here that Clara began therapy. Dr. Melissa Hart arrived with soft shoes and a gentler voice, carrying crayons and sketch pads instead of forms. She didn't press questions. She spread paper on the rug, sat nearby, and let Clara's silence breathe. Clara sat cross-legged, her sweater still too large, braid hanging loose. She didn't speak, but when Orion lowered himself beside her, she leaned against him. Her fingers curled into his fur. That was enough for Dr. Hart to smile and begin. The first drawing was harsh black bars pressed deep into the paper, a stick figure behind them with no mouth. Victor, watching from the kitchen doorway, broke inside, but Ethan steadied him. This is her voice, he whispered. Day after day, Clara drew. Houses with barred windows, shadowy figures, a girl always silent, and always beside her, a dog. At first crude, just ears and a tail, then clearer, a shepherd standing guard. Orion never left her side. If she moved to the couch, he followed. If she curled into a corner with crayons, he lay down beside her, his breathing a steady metronome of safety. Dr. Hart confided to Ethan, He's her anchor. Sometimes children can't trust people right away. But an animal, they don't lie. He's her bridge back. Ethan nodded. He listened before anyone else. Maybe she knows that. Weeks passed. Slowly the drawing shifted. Bars became doors. The silent girl grew eyes, then a face. The dog grew larger, more detailed, always between her and the shadows. It happened on a grey Wednesday. Clara had spent the session sketching Orion with remarkable detail. His ears, his eyes, even the tilt of his head. When Dr. Hart began to pack up, Clara stayed close to the shepherd, her hand resting on his fur. She leaned in, lips parting. At first, it was just a breath, then a word, fragile, cracked. Orion. The shepherd's ears twitched. He lifted his head, tail thumping once. Clara pressed her face to his neck and whispered it again, firmer this time. Orion. Victor froze in the doorway. Tears blurred his eyes as he stumbled forward, dropping to his knees. Sweetheart. His voice broke. Clara didn't look at him. She whispered Orion's name again, clutching the dog's fur as though it were the only rope holding her steady. "Doctor." Hart's eyes glistened. "That's her first word in months," she murmured. "She chose him." Ethan crouched, brushing his hand along Orion's back. "She chose right." Victor reached for her hand. This time, she didn't pull away. She let his fingers close around hers, though her gaze never left Orion. In that small, tremulous moment, trust began to kindle. That night, Clara lay in bed with Orion stretched at her feet. Victor tucked her in, kissed her forehead, and whispered, "Thank you." He didn't know if he meant his daughter, the shepherd, or something beyond both. In the quiet, Clara stirred, lips moving again around the only name she trusted. Orion. The sound was soft, but to Ethan, listening from the hall, it was a hymn. The first pure note of healing. Silver Creek had always thrived on gossip, but the Hale Mansion story spread like wildfire. First whispers, then headlines. Retired K9 saves girl from family conspiracy. Reporters arrived. News vans parked crooked on Main Street. They told the tale of Ethan Cole, the detective who listened, and Orion, the shepherd who refused to look away. Clara's identity was shielded, but everyone knew. Ethan avoided the spotlight, slipping into the diner at odd hours. Still, strangers stopped him in parking lots, elders clasped his arm at church, and Orion became a local legend. Children rushed to pet him on the street, calling him the hero dog. Parents told the story at bedtime. Even the old veterans at the VFW nodded solemnly when he passed. Victor shielded Clara from the frenzy, but even in silence she felt the town's kindness. A lollipop at the store, a librarian saving books for her. Everywhere, people looked at her differently. She was no longer invisible. One afternoon, Ethan entered Marla's diner. The room quieted. Then, slowly, applause broke out. He froze, uncomfortable. Orion simply sat, ears perked, tail sweeping once across the floor. Marla came from behind the counter, eyes damp. She kissed Orion's head. "Good boy," she whispered. Then, to Ethan, this town needed a hero. Turns out he walks on 4 legs. That night, Ethan sat on his porch with Orion at his feet. Neighbors waved casseroles across the street. He nodded politely, but his words to Orion were quieter. "They see a hero," he murmured, "but I see the nights you didn't sleep, the way you carried her fear when no one else could. You weren't just her protector. You were her voice." Orion thumped his tail once, his gaze steady. The news vans left. The papers moved on. But in Silver Creek, the story lingered, told in pews and barbershops, over fences and kitchen tables. Not just about villains exposed, or a detective's persistence, but about a shepherd's loyalty and a child's silence broken. And for Clara, nestled safe in her father's arms, with Orion always nearby, it was proof that she was no longer hidden. Her story had been heard. In a town that once turned away from closed doors, people listened differently now. They listened because a dog had. The courthouse in Silver Creek had never seen a day like this. Normally its oak-paneled chambers handled petty thefts and traffic disputes, but on this gray Monday morning every pew in the gallery was filled. Neighbors leaned in, whispering not about fines or fences, but about a child hidden in silence and the 2 people accused of stealing her voice. At the front, sat Selina Ward and Richard Hale. Selina's pearls gleamed like shackles, her composure fraying. Richard lounged with hollow bravado, but his darting eyes betrayed him. And rising before the jury was Shelby Torres. Known for her ferocity in child protection cases, she carried no hesitation in her step. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice cutting clean through the air. "This case is not about wealth or guardianship. Strip away the polish, and you will see what it truly is: conspiracy, coercion, and the imprisonment of a child's voice." Her case unfolded with devastating precision. Forged guardianship papers. Financial transfers in Richard's favor. Witnesses describing locked doors, hushed cries. A girl who seemed to vanish inside her own home. But it wasn't the documents that silenced the room. It was what Shelby held up next. A child's drawing. Crayon lines sketched bars across windows. Behind them, a small girl with no mouth. Beside her, larger than life, a dog with pointed ears stood guard. "This," Shelby said softly, "is Clara Hale's testimony. She could not speak it, so she drew it. These are not doodles. These are cries for help." Gasps stirred in the gallery. Clara herself sat with the victim's advocate near the front, a pale dress hanging loose on her thin frame, her braid fraying at the edges. She did not look at Selina or Richard. Her eyes were fixed on Orion. The shepherd lay at Ethan's feet in the back row, calm and watchful. His ears twitched as if he, too, understood the weight of those drawings. Then Shelby pressed play. The courtroom filled with Selina's own voice. "You miss your mommy? She's ashes now. Do you want me to scatter them on the curb?" Jurors flinched. A woman in the gallery covered her mouth. Selina jolted upright, sputtering, but her lawyer forced her back down. Next came Richard. "Victor hasn't woken up in years. Once the courts agree, the girl is ours." Victor Hale bowed his head, shame burning his face. Then Clara's hand slipped into his. He looked up again, anchored by the fragile weight of her trust. By the time the last recording ended, the silence was deafening. No polished defense could erase the cruelty of their voices. Shelby let the pause hang before she spoke again. "Justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Today, I ask you to hear it loud and clear." The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. When they returned, the town of Silver Creek held its breath. On the count of fraud, guilty. Selina flinched, pearls rattling at her throat. On conspiracy to defraud guardianship, guilty. Richard's smirk collapsed, sweat beading his brow. On child endangerment, guilty. The gallery gasped. Clara squeezed Orion's collar tighter, pressing into his warmth. Judge Harrington leaned forward, his weathered voice steady. "This court will not tolerate the exploitation of grief, nor the silencing of innocence. Selina Ward is sentenced to 10 years in state prison. Richard Hale to 8. Both without parole during their term." The gavel thundered, sealing the verdict. Selina's mask shattered into screams. "She's nothing without me!" Deputies dragged her out. Richard stayed quiet, but his silence was colder, his wrists clinking in steel. Victor slumped as though crushed, tears streaking his face. "I let them in," he whispered to Ethan. "I let them take her voice." Ethan crouched, gripping his shoulder. "They twisted your grief, but you never stopped loving Clara. That love is why she's alive now. Don't forget that." Victor's eyes filled again. When Clara slipped her hand into his, he broke into sobs, pressing her close. For the first time in months, she leaned into him willingly. In the back, Orion's tail thumped once against the floorboards. Weeks later, the auditorium of Silver Creek Elementary was packed to the rafters. Folding chairs squeaked, programs fluttered, the PTA table smelled of cookies and varnish. But the town hadn't gathered for sugar or song alone. They had come to see if Clara Hale would step into the light. Backstage, she stood with a violin tucked nervously beneath her chin. Her pale blue dress trembled with her knees. Victor sat in the second row, hands knotted, lips moving with silent prayers. Ethan sat 2 seats over, arms folded, and Orion waited in the front row, ears perked, still as stone. When Clara walked onto the stage, the crowd hushed. The spotlight burned. For a moment she faltered. She heard the echo of old silence, the smothering darkness of the mansion's locked room, and then she saw him, Orion, sitting straight, tail wagging once, eyes locked on hers. "I'm here. Play." Her chest loosened. She raised the bow and drew it across the strings. The first note wavered, fragile, but it held. Then another. A simple melody spread through the hall, thin at first, then steady. Not flawless, but wholly hers. Every rise and fall was a declaration. "I'm still here." Victor's tears ran unchecked. Ethan's jaw tightened, his vision blurring. The audience leaned forward, breathless. Halfway through, Clara closed her eyes. She played not for the crowd, not even for her father, but for the dog who had carried her sobs when no one else listened. Each note was a thread, stitching her past into something new. Then, the final note. It lingered, trembling in the air, before dissolving into silence. Clara lowered her bow, chest rising and falling. Her gaze found Orion again. She stepped to the microphone, her voice so soft at first the audience wondered if they imagined it. But then it came. Fragile, certain, clear. "I'm not afraid anymore." The words rippled through the hall. Victor gasped, covering his face. Ethan swallowed hard, his throat burning. Orion's tail swept the floor once, deliberate, as though he had been waiting for this moment all along. The auditorium erupted. Applause thundered, parents wiping tears, neighbors clasping hands. Some stood, clapping harder, louder, as if their ovation could erase every shadow that had clung to the child. Clara bowed her head shyly, but her lips curved in the faintest smile. She walked off stage straighter than she had come on, reaching instinctively for Orion's fur as he pressed close, her guardian in every step. Ethan stood back, letting the moment belong to her. For all the headlines, the verdicts, the cameras, this was justice, a child finding her voice again. As the applause faded, whispers filled the crowd. Not gossip this time, but awe. She spoke. "She's healing. That dog gave her back her life." Ethan looked down at Orion, the shepherd calm in the storm of sound. He didn't need medals or applause. He had his reward already, in the sound of Clara's voice, fragile but free. 3 words heavier than any verdict. 3 words that turned silence into song. The Hale mansion on the hill had been sold, its white columns stripped of the secrets they once held. For Silver Creek, it was just another house that passed into new hands. For Victor and Clara, it had been a prison too heavy to live in again. Their new beginning came months later, in a modest home on Willow Street. The red front door was chipped at the corners. Wild daisies leaned across the yard, where trimmed hedges once stood. A swing set squeaked with every breeze. The kitchen smelled of lemon soap and fresh bread, and the wooden floors carried honest scuff marks from years of life. It wasn't grandeur, but it was warm, and warmth was all Clara needed. One Saturday afternoon, Ethan's truck rumbled into the driveway. Orion leapt down before the engine was off, trotting toward the yard with unhurried certainty. Clara, crouched near the flower bed, with chalk in her hands, shot up the instant she saw him. "My brave soldier," she cried, her voice clear, strong. She flung her arms around his neck, braid bouncing against her back. Orion stood steady, amber eyes closing in quiet contentment as she buried her face in his fur. Ethan climbed out, smiling. "Careful, kiddo. You'll wear him out before I get a hello." Clara grinned. "Hi, Uncle Ethan." The title came naturally to her, and Ethan never corrected it. Warmth bloomed in his chest every time she said it. On the porch, Victor wiped flour from his hands. He looked healthier now, color in his cheeks, steadiness in his frame. "Bread's almost done," he called. "And Clara's been waiting all morning for you two." She tugged Orion toward the swing set. "Come on, watch me swing higher than the roof." The shepherd followed, his body a shadow that matched hers. Ethan leaned against the porch rail beside Victor. "She's different," he murmured. Victor's gaze softened on his daughter. "She laughs in her sleep sometimes. The therapist says it's healing. I can't even explain what that sound does to me." Ethan nodded. He didn't need the explanation. The afternoon unfolded gently. Clara drew chalk pictures on the patio. Orion with ears taller than the house, paws like shields. In one sketch, she scrawled a smaller stick figure labeled Uncle Ethan. Ethan chuckled when she handed it over. "You made me shorter than the dog." "Because Orion's the hero," she said matter-of-factly. "You just help." "Fair enough," Ethan replied, ruffling her hair. That evening they gathered at the kitchen table for warm bread and butter. Clara insisted Orion sit beside her chair, slipping him crumbs he accepted with patient dignity. For Ethan, the air smelled like home, a scent he hadn't felt in years. After dinner, Clara lifted her violin on the porch. She played a short, bright tune. When the final note faded, she bowed with theatrical flourish. "That was for Orion," she declared, "because he never left me." Victor's eyes glistened. Ethan swallowed hard. Orion simply sat, ears perked, tail sweeping once across the floorboards. As the sun dipped behind the pines, Clara curled into Ethan's lap. "You're my Uncle Ethan," she murmured. Her hand slipped into Orion's fur. "And you're my brave soldier." Across the porch, Victor met Ethan's gaze. Neither man spoke. They didn't need to. The proof of healing was right there in Clara's words, in her laughter, in her drawings with no shadows. The house on Willow Street wasn't perfect, but it was home. And Orion remained what he had always been. Not just a dog, not just a hero, but the guardian who had carried a little girl from fear into freedom. October brought the Harvest Festival. Lanterns strung between lampposts glowed warm, the smell of cinnamon cider drifting over hay bales and folding chairs. But this year the town gathered for more than the season. On the small stage, Clara Hale stood with her violin. Her dress was simple, but in the slanting light she looked luminous, fragile, yet steady. Victor sat in the front row, hands clasped tight. Ethan sat 2 seats over. Orion stretched tall at his feet, ears pricked. Mrs. Whitman, the MC, tapped the microphone. "Our final performance this evening is an original piece. Clara Hale calls it Orion's Song." A hush fell. Clara closed her eyes. The bow trembled in her hand, but when she drew it across the strings, sound rose. Not silence, not fear, but music. The opening was low, haunting, the echo of nights behind locked doors. People leaned forward, breath caught. Victor's tears brimmed. Ethan sat still as stone. Orion didn't move, his eyes fixed on Clara. Then the melody shifted. Braver now, climbing, weaving threads of hope through fear. Fragile steps into light. Clara's face flushed with focus, each note carrying her truth. The music built, stronger, fuller, until it resolved in a pure, gentle theme. A sound like home, like safety, like the soft thump of a tail against the floor. The final note lingered before dissolving into the autumn air. For a heartbeat, there was only silence. The reverent kind. Then the crowd erupted. Cheers, clapping, voices calling her name. Victor covered his face, shoulders shaking. Ethan clapped hard, throat tight with awe. Orion wagged his tail once, slow and deliberate. Clara looked down at him. Her lips moved silently. "Thank you." She stepped off the stage into Victor's arms. Ethan smiled quietly from behind, but it was Orion she reached for first, burying her hands in his fur, forehead pressed to his neck. The music had released her. Her voice had returned, and she gave its first gratitude to the one who had never left. That night, after the festival lanterns dimmed, Ethan sat at the kitchen table in Willow Street's little house. A leather-bound journal lay open. He hadn't written since Anna died. Words had felt useless then. But Clara's music had unlocked something steady in him. His pen scratched across the page. Justice doesn't always come with handcuffs or gavels. Sometimes it comes in whispers, in the quiet thump of a tail on the floor, in the way a dog refuses to move from a locked door. Orion barked when no one else would. Because he did, a child's voice was returned. From the living room came Clara's soft humming, drifting from her sleep. Victor had carried her upstairs earlier, but Orion remained at the foot of the couch, head on his paws, ears tilted toward her. Her small hand dangled, fingers brushing his fur even in dreams. Ethan paused, chest tight at the sight. He wrote again. Some heroes don't need medals. They don't carry guns or wear uniforms. They simply stay. Loyal, unshaken, steady in the storm. Orion doesn't ask for thanks. His truth is his loyalty. And that loyalty saved Clara from silence. He set the pen down. The house was quiet now, but not the kind of silence that once smothered. This silence was gentle, born of safety, the kind that lets the weary breathe. Ethan closed the journal and looked at Orion. The shepherd lifted his head, amber eyes steady in the lamplight. "Good work, partner," Ethan whispered. Orion gave a single slow thump of his tail against the floor. And in that quiet house on Willow Street, a little girl slept without fear, her voice free at last. Victor appeared in the doorway, a blanket draped over his shoulders. His face was tired, but softer than Ethan had ever seen it. "She's asleep," he said quietly. Ethan nodded. "She did well tonight." Victor's voice broke. She spoke. They stood in the quiet together, the weight of everything they had survived pressing down like the night sky outside the windows. Yet it was no longer unbearable. Clara shifted upstairs, murmuring something unintelligible, and Orion's ears flicked instantly, eyes turning toward the staircase. When no cry followed, he laid his head back down. But Ethan saw it again. That readiness, that promise, written in muscle and instinct. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his gaze softening. He won't ever stop watching her, you know. Victor followed his eyes to Orion. I know. And I thank God for it every day. They let the silence settle again, but this time it wasn't empty. It was full of unspoken gratitude. Later, when Ethan closed his journal, he lingered over the last line he had written. Justice found us in silence. Healing began in a song. And through it all, Orion stood guard, the truth that saved us when words failed. He closed the book gently and carried it to the mantel, placing it beside Clara's newest drawing, a picture of herself holding a violin, Orion at her feet, and a tall figure with a badge drawn in crayon beside them. Underneath, she had scrawled, "My family." Outside, the autumn wind rattled the windows, but inside, warmth held fast. Clara breathed peacefully upstairs. Victor dozed lightly in his chair, and Orion, ever watchful, ever steady, kept his post at the girl's side. His ears perked at every sound, his eyes open, his presence a silent vow. He didn't need words. He never had. His loyalty was enough. And in that loyalty was the truth that had saved them all. Sometimes the greatest lessons in love and loyalty don't come from people at all, but from the quiet presence of a dog at our side. Stories like Clara and Orion's remind us that German shepherds, and so many other faithful companions, have a way of carrying us through the hardest seasons, asking nothing in return but a place in our hearts. If you've ever looked into your dog's eyes and felt understood without a single word, you know what I mean. That bond is rare, sacred, and worth cherishing. If you'd like to explore ways to deepen that connection, there's a resource I've found meaningful. It's not flashy, just thoughtful ideas for strengthening trust and understanding with your own dog. I'll leave the link here for you to check when the time feels right. At the end of the day, it isn't about training or perfection. It's about the quiet moments, the shared walks, the steady gaze, the simple comfort of knowing you're never alone. Take care of your dog, and let them take care of you. That's the kind of loyalty that carries us all the way home.